Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Giulia Mugellini from the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, and I'm used to cover issues related to victimization surveys on households and businesses, and also on corruption victimization surveys. And today I'm going to answer two main questions. The first one is related to the main differences between crime victimization surveys implemented in households and those implemented in businesses, among businesses. The main difference between victimization surveys on households and on businesses are actually related to the type of population covered. This issue can influence other methodological aspects of conducting victimization surveys on households and on businesses. For example, the wording of the questions addressed to the respondent. For example, persons working within businesses are usually more technically skilled on specific types of crime. If the right person within the business is addressed, this is a very important issue. And in this case, in case of victimization survey among businesses, the wording of the questions can be a bit more technical than victimization surveys targeted at households. And another big difference is related to the reliability of information concerns the fact that businesses usually register crimes happen within their institution. They have internal registers, especially big companies, but more and more often also small companies can register these crimes. And for them, it is easier to report information on the exact amount of crimes experienced in the last 12 months or three years. And this could affect the issue of memory decay and telescoping effect. So when you are analyzing data coming from businesses, victimization surveys, you have to keep in mind that usually data on the number of crimes experienced can be more reliable than those collected among households and individuals in general. In addition, household components might have more doubt on the meaning of the question. This is why it's important not only how the question is formulated, but also how the data is collected. In relation to household surveys, it's usually better to collect the data through face-to-face interviews or computer-assisted telephone interviews, because in case the respondent is not sure about the meaning of the question, it can ask the interviewer, for more explanation. And in some cases, the interviewers can show him a table of crimes with a related description. And this helps a lot the understanding of the questioner, and as a consequence, the reliability of the results collected through these victimization surveys. In case of business victimization surveys, it is possible to collect the data through computer-assisted web interviewing, which means through online questionnaires. This methodology has pros and cons. The main advantage is that business managers are usually very busy and not very likely to give face-to-face interviews or even telephone interviews if they are longer than 5 seconds. Therefore, allowing them to answer online whenever they have time, and to stop the questionnaire and begin again the questionnaire whenever they want, it is a big plus for businesses. On the other side, this methodology proved to have pretty low response rates. So even if it is easier to collect data on business managers, and it is also easier to ask more sensitive questionnaire through an online questionnaire because there is no direct interaction between the respondent and the interviewer, so the people feel less guilty, or they feel less the risk of reputational damage. The response rate can be quite low through this type of methodology. These are the main differences which affect both the structure and formulation of the questions and the way the data are collected. Another big differences in conducting household surveys and victimization surveys concerns the fact that in case of business surveys, it is usually easier to find registers where you can select your sample. And this is, of course, something which also affects the ability of disaggregating and stratifying the sample according to the characteristics you want to address. For example, the economic sector of the business, the size of the business, the turnover. And of course, the availability of a good register where you can select the sample is definitely something which differentiates household and business surveys. Concerning the second question, should questions on corruption be included in general victimization surveys, or should ad hoc surveys be developed instead of including a question in a general victimization survey? Well, this decision depends on two main factors. The available resources to develop the survey. Of course, if you include a question on corruption within a victimization survey, you are able to cover several types of crime through one instrument. So you save money. You save money in terms of covering more than one type of crime. And the second issue is related to how many disaggregated information you need on the types of corruption. Of course, if you include corruption within a victimization survey, you can't go too deep into the corruption issues. You can't answer questions on the specific types of corruption, the procedures, the administrative procedures during which corruption happened, the public officials, the types of public officials involved in the Corruption Act, the reasons why bribe or corruption took place, and like also question about whether the Corruption Act were reported or not, the reason for not reporting the crime, and so on and so forth. So the problem is when you include questions on corruption within victimization survey, you have a limited set of questions which can be included to avoid the survey being too long to be efficiently implemented. Therefore, if you need to investigate more in detail the issue of corruption, I would suggest, of course, to develop ad hoc standalone survey on corruption. But of course, this is largely dependent on the amount of resources available to develop ad hoc survey on one type of crime. I can give you some figures. We just collected information on the existing instruments to measure corruption. And we noticed that 53% of these instruments were ad hoc surveys on corruption, while 47% in 47% of these instruments, one question of corruption was included in victimization survey. Therefore, actually, we can say that half existing instruments are standalone surveys on corruption, and half decided to include a question in victimization surveys, including other crimes besides corruption. What is important to remember is that the Sustainable Development Goals indicators on corruption suggest to include at least 2 questions on the amount of corruption. The proportion of persons in contact with public officials who paid a bribe to public officials or were requested to pay a bribe during the previous 12 months, and the proportion of businesses in contact with public officials who paid a bribe or were requested to pay a bribe during the previous 12 months. So independently of whether you will include a question on corruption in victimization survey or develop ad hoc victimization surveys on corruption, the requirement of the Sustainable Development Goals is to include these 2 types of measurement. Thank you very much for your attention.